Christopher Strachey proposed that these objects should be treated as first class, meaning they can be stored in a data structure or assigned to a variable. The anonymous types of these objects can be represented as their lambda type using preceding square brackets in C++ or an arrow in Java 8. These entities are tracked by storing their return addresses in a call stack. The void keyword is used to indicate that these entities do not return a value. These objects are recursive if they keep making calls to themselves until a base condition is met. For 10 points, name these objects which can take arguments as inputs and return outputs. And the answer is functions. These structures are implemented incorrectly in a fence post error. During compilation, these structures are often optimized with a procedure called unrolling. The continue keyword passes control on to the next one of these structures within a program. Nesting one of these structures in another creates a program with a big O of n squared runtime. The keywords in, for, and while are used to declare one of these structures. If one of these structures lacks a terminating condition, it will run indefinitely until the computer runs out of memory. For 10 points, name these blocks of code which repeatedly execute their contents until a condition is met. And the answer is loops. This quantity lends its name to a type of attack that relied on a side channel into the data cache that forced Intel to redesign its CPUs in the Spectre exploit. This quantity can be unified across servers by Christian's algorithm and David Mills' NTP algorithm. Contact with NASA's Deep Impact probe was likely lost due to an overflow in the variable representing this quantity. January 1st, 1970 is an anchor point for the version of this quantity used by Unix. JavaScript's moment library can parse strings into this quantity. Programs that stored this quantity in an insufficient number of digits had to be fixed to avoid the Y2K bug. For 10 points, name this value often stored in computer files as a namesake stamp that indicates when the file was last modified. And the answer is time. One algorithm used to perform this task applies alternating rounds of S and P boxes, allowing for inherent parallelism, which isn't possible when implementing a Feistel network. A textbook named for this process by William Buchanan is one of many to use Eve as a third participant. The introduction of the Merkle-Damgard construction allowed for the construction of MD5 and SHA1, two hash functions whose properties make it useful for this task. Since Shor's algorithm would make prime factorization a polynomial time task, it would render an algorithm used to perform this task useless. A public key algorithm used for this task is RSA. For 10 points, name this task which involves securing data so that only the intended recipient can read it. And the answer is encryption. So-called third-generation types of these programs typically work on the application level of the OSI model and are more advanced than stateful types of these programs, which operate by examining but not touching a datagram. One example of how these programs work is only allowing the usage of UDP or TCP and completely disallowing FTP or the file transfer protocol. These programs are often put in front of a load balancer, and they often cannot prevent a denial of service attack since they cannot keep track of every IP address. It is common to make a pinhole in these programs to allow for some kinds of traffic through. For 10 points, name these programs that monitor traffic on a network, one of which is the flagship product of John McAfee's namesake company. And the answer is firewalls. In the gray code scheme, entries are ordered such that adjacent entries differ by exactly one of these units. In information theory, One of these units is equivalent to the information content of an event occurring with probability 1/2, which is why these units are often called Shannons. Arithmetic commands such as left shift and rotate are known as this word-wise operations since they manipulate these units in constant time. Computer architecture is often classified by the number of these units that comprise a word. CPUs are also often classified by whether they handle registers that store 32 or 64 of these units. These are the smallest units, often prefixed with kibi, meaning that there are 1,024 of them. For 10 points, name these units, 8 of which comprise a byte. And the answer is bits. An efficient way to explore this object is given by Warnsdorf rule, which is a heuristic that minimizes onward moves. Removing two components of the same type from this object makes it mutilated and thus impossible to tile with dominoes according to Gomery's theorem. Arranging 8 agents on this object is the subject of a backtracking algorithm by Edsger Dijkstra that illustrated his concept of structured programming. There exist closed and open variants of finding a way to traverse this object using only L-shaped jumps. A common discrete mathematics problem is to arrange 8 queens so that they cannot attack each other on, for 10 points, what object whose squares are all visited in a knight's tour. And the answer is chessboard. In 1950, a computer scientist at the Rand Institute used this adjective to describe his research to hide its mathematical nature from politicians. This adjective describes an approach to algorithm design that solves overlapping subproblems. The CYK parsing algorithm is an example of it. Amortized analysis is used to study arrays described by this adjective. Those arrays have individual elements need to be copied over when they are resized, in contrast to fixed-length arrays. Memory that is put onto the heap is allocated in this fashion, often using the C functions malloc and free. This adjective describes a type of random access memory that is volatile, and it puts the D in DRAM. For 10 points, give this opposite of static. And the answer is dynamic. Near the end of his life, this scientist wrote a set of messages from the unseen world, one of which describes hyperboloids of wondrous light that might play out God's holy pantomime. This man built on the work of Kurt Gödel in a 1936 paper that sought to solve David Hilbert's Entscheidungs problem by introducing the concept of effectively computable procedures. This scientist showed an algorithm does not exist which determines whether or not an arbitrary algorithm would terminate for a given input, thus providing a negative answer to the halting problem. He names a thesis with Alonzo Church about the power of various models of computation. For 10 points, name this scientist who modeled computation with his namesake machines. And the answer is Alan Turing. This operator's name was first introduced in the second volume of a book called Analytsch-Zahlen Theory, published in 1894 by Paul Bachmann. In a Taylor series, this operator can be used to express higher-order terms that are negligible, truncating the series. For any function f of x, is this operator of g of x if f of x divided by g of x yields a constant term. The quicksort algorithm runs in linear arithmetic, or this operator, of n log n time. For 10 points, name this notation used for analyzing the efficiency of computer algorithms or a function's asymptotic behavior. And the answer is big O notation.